Welcome to another week and another week of brand new content. So you guys just barely took exam one, and good news, all the material we're going to be going over now is going to be on the new test, but all of the past material, we're not reviewing it anymore. That's going to stay back there. None of these exams are cumulative. Whether you celebrate or not, it's up to you. But let's go ahead and get started. This week, we're going to be covering pests and pesticides. Okay, so very first off, I just want to be able to make sure there's going to be a lot of content, a lot of things that we're going over. I'm going to try to help you as much as possible to be able to cipher through what is the important key details to know for the assignments, but then as well the general knowledge and information just to be knowledgeable and aware of this content as well. So there's going to be a ton of pictures, so hopefully that'll make the abstract more stract, and we can be able to just dive right in. So first of all, what are pests? Pests, you can be able to define very simply any organism that causes disease or a nuisance, particularly ones that negatively affect human interests. So it could be any organism at all, plants, animals, anything. So some examples of that include mice, crickets, mosquitoes, spiders, birds. So like all of these, you can be able to look at rats, bam. Spiders, roaches, flies, mice, cricket, ant, mice, that bug, cicadas, and mosquitoes. Kids, not a nuisance. Not, I mean, sometimes they're a nuisance, but that's not the point. Not considered pests as far as this class at all. But continuing on. So first one we're going to talk about are insects themselves. And so insects, just gotta move that. Insects, we're going to be talking about a variety of different kinds. First three, we're going to discuss lice, mites, and bed bugs. So lice, commonly found on both the head, body, pubic region. They're typically spread only person-to-person contact. Actually, if you look into the reading, lice aren't really found anywhere else. I mean, there are different forms of lice that are on specific types of animals. However, found naturally in the environment, it doesn't really exist. It's typically just on humans or on a host itself. The most commonly associated disease transmitted by lice that we're concerned with, at least, is trench fever. This actually resulted and was very common during World War One, specifically during the trench warfare in Eastern Europe. But it typically brought itself on a fever, malaise, pain in your shins specifically is a unique feature, and it typically lasts 5 days. But it's that connection between lice causing trench fever. Next are mites, are these small little red arachnids. So again, most commonly people associate arachnids as with spiders. However, an arachnid is by definition just has 8 legs to it. This one typically could be person/animal to person contact, so you could pick it up from a variety of different organisms. And their most common thing that they transmit is scabies. So mites are scabies. Next, bed bugs. This one's probably the most common. I feel a lot of people have definitively heard of bed bugs, possibly even lice too, from like elementary school and things like that. But bed bugs, very commonly, they hide in furniture and mattresses. These also are known as very lazy eaters, as you can be able to see in this bottom picture right underneath it. They're lazy eaters because they typically bite in a row. For example, right here in the picture, you can be able to see that all of the bites are pretty much in sequence. They typically bite, walk a little bit, bite, walk a little bit, bite, walk a little bit, bite, then go to bed. That's about it. So they're very lazy. Their main attribute is that their bites typically just cause red, itchy welts. And the reading and some of the information this week goes a little bit more into bed bugs specifically. And then, of course, the office, that they helped teach us that bed bugs, they are also very smug, and they think it's very funny. If you don't get that reference, that's okay. All these other pictures are just pictures that illustrate what these animals or these insects actually look like. But yeah, you won't be required, like we're not going to show you a picture of a bug and say, what is this bug? But this is just to get you a general idea and hopefully making these make sense a little bit more, because a lot of these you can't see or easily see. Okay, so next we're going to look at more insects. So we're going to look at chiggers. So this is often referred to as well as a berry bug. If you look in that picture right next to it, it kind of looks like a little red raspberry, and that's why they're called the berry bug. They look like a little bug. I know back in Missouri, these were absolutely everywhere. It was a sign that you went outside that day, as if you had these small little pimple-like bumps from them biting you. And so they're just very, very, very small red specks, almost like the dot of a pencil. And they are actually a type of mite. So again, the mites that we went on before, that's actually a wide variety of types of insects. And so a chigger is a type of mite. Very interesting thing is their saliva actually has the ability to digest and break down skin very, very easily. So what they typically do is they typically you can think of it like as far as drooling on the skin so that it digests it, and then they just drink up that liquefied skin. This is going to be a gross week, by the way, if you don't like insects and bugs. Actually, I had to prepare this in the other room because my wife had wanted no part of it. And so either way, if you do have kind of a harder time, it's just one of those, just muscle through it as best you can. I tried to pick the most tame pictures as well, since we're going to be talking about some diseases and conditions as well. But next, chagas. So chagas are otherwise known as the kissing bugs. So what these are is whenever they bite you, you have the possibility of being able to develop an enlarged heart, colon, or esophagus. It reacts very badly with our insides, and it can be able to cause a condition known as Chagas disease. That one should hopefully be an easy one to remember. Chagas disease. But they're called kissing bugs, typically because they like to bite people's faces specifically. And one of the things that they naturally do after they bite, once they digest, they actually defecate immediately. And so then they poop right into that open wound, and that's where a lot of this disease spreading comes from. So Chagas, that's what that picture is right there as well. Just a small black little bug. Most of these are very common in necessarily South America, and some of them I guess as well in North America as well. I'm unfamiliar if they're also present in countries such as, or continents like Africa or even Europe or Asia. But next, very, very big one, fleas. So fleas, you may already know this, they are the most likely to cause a plague, is fleas and being bitten by a flea itself. There's three specific plagues that we're going to discuss about and you should know about in this class. One of those including bubonic plague, possibly the most famous plague. That is otherwise known as the Black Death. That Black Death that happened during, I believe it was the 1300s. It only lasted for about 7 years, but it wiped out nearly 75 to 200 million people within the Western Eurasia area. And so it was very, very bad. So a good example of what it causes, the bubonic plague specifically targeted the lymphatic system. So you have lymph nodes all over your body in different locations that help be able to collect and kind of refine different materials. It's a very good storage area. And so the bubonic plague targeted those lymphatic systems and caused them to be able to swell up and kind of build up this pussy matter. That's what you can be able to see on that picture right in the central, about mid right. There's some buboes, either way. Those are swollen lymph nodes that are actually on that individual's inner thigh. And then another plague is septicemic plague. So this is the bubonic plague, but there's no buboes or buboes, whatever it is. There's no swelling of the lymph nodes. And so again, septicemic plague is bubonic plague, but there is no swelling of lymph nodes. So if bubonic plague progresses long enough, it affects the circulatory system, so your heart and your bloods, and that's where we see in that bottom right corner where that individual, even though it looks like he dunked his hand in some paint and just got it just covered, it looks coated like that, his fingers are actually slowly dying based upon that poor blood circulation that's starting with the extremities and slowly moving forward. Again, that was the most tame picture I could be able to find that could kind of illustrate this. But it happens throughout your entire body, typically starting with your extremities, such as your hands and your feet, and then working backwards towards your heart. Then we have our third kind. So again, top three plagues that we're going to discuss at least: bubonic plague, septicemic plague, and then lastly, pneumonic plague. This one, pneumonic, if you've taken medical terminology, you'll kind of better recognize or be familiar with that kind of medical terminology wording, but it has to do with the respiratory system. So this one typically, this one had, I believe, a case to fatality rate of close to between 30 to 100%. If you're undiagnosed, it was almost a certainty you're going to die. And it's traditionally spread from person to person as well. So that those three pictures up at the top right, there's one that's A, that's the most left, then the middle one B, then the right one C. This one actually is a fairly recent, I believe it was back in like the early 2000s as well. An individual went into a hospital complaining that they couldn't breathe. They were diagnosed with pneumonic plague, and picture A was whenever they were first admitted into the hospital. And so, as you can be able to see, if you haven't ever interpreted a radiograph before, especially with the lungs are very thin materials, so x-rays pass through them very easily. Again, x-rays have a very hard time passing through things that are more dense. They can pass through our body, but they have a more likelihood of not passing through. That's where the white shows up. So we can see skeletal system, it's more dense than the muscle, and as well as the fat and the flesh lining. So either way, as you can see in A, it's a lot more white. That means that it's just a lot more dense, a lot more, not necessarily scar tissue, but a lot less of healthy lungs being there. A lot, your lungs actually collapse in on themselves with pneumonic plague. But as it progressed, I believe that this was even 10 days after treatment, is a lot better, a lot more lung function able to occur. And then C was whenever he was right before he was discharged. He was actually almost back right to normal. So if you are treated, you can be able to recover actually fairly easy nowadays. But it was that untreatedness that can be able to actually make some trouble for it. But again, the primary individuals that cause this, that's fleas. So again, a while ago, the bubonic plague, during the Black Death, they primarily blamed rats. However, it wasn't rats. It was the fleas that were on the rats. And that's what the rats were just a vector or a host that, not a host, that a vector that brought these fleas into proximity with other humans. But definitely make sure to understand those three plagues, at least being able to associate that fleas cause those three. That's it. Okay, and all right, next, more insects, yay! So next we're going to talk about ticks. So ticks, there's quite a bit to it. I feel this is a very common thing that a lot of people know, typically animal to person. So we typically pick up ticks either in the wild or from, let's say, a dog, for example, that top middle picture. But it's important to be able to know that you have to be able to make sure to remove them in a very specific way. They typically, if you haven't associated with ticks very much, they're not good company anyway to associate with. They typically bite in, and then their head is almost cemented into your skin. So it's very, very important that whenever you're removing them, that you try to grab as close to the head as possible and try to pull out. If you look in that top middle picture, that little yellow thing, it's a hook to be able to slide underneath the head to be able to pull it out. If you ever get a tick and you just pull it out with your hands, you really have to look and make sure that you pulled out the head and even some of the actual teeth or arms that are there, as any part of that tick could transmit some of those tick-borne illnesses. So biggest factor, they drink host blood, they live in the tall grass. If you're ever interacting with them or want to be able to prevent them, that's where you're going to want to wear long pants, long sleeves, anything to be able to reduce the amount of open surface skin where they might attach to. So ticks, again, they primarily, we're going to focus on 4 different diseases that they could contribute to or be carrying to then pass it on. First one is tularemia, which is skin ulcers. I don't have a very good picture of that one, but next one is ehrlichiosis. And so this one is caused by the Lone Star tick. So if you see that bottom middle picture, it has that dot right on the back. That's actually the Lone Star tick itself. Ehrlichiosis, it just causes fever, muscle ache, and upset stomach. Then we get into some of the more serious diseases that ticks can be able to transmit. Tularemia is very serious as well, but some of the most notable ones include Lyme disease and Rocky Mountain spotted fever. So Lyme disease, that causes, up in that top right, there's 2 pictures. It's a bullseye type rash, and that's one of the most notable notable conditions that a tick can be able to cause. And it's it's not very subtle. It's very obvious as far as when an individual has Lyme disease, but Lyme disease can cause you to have joint pain almost the rest of your life if you do get it. Rocky Mountain spotted fever, if you look on that all the way to the right along the side, both the middle, the 2 middle pictures, there's just spots all over an individual's arm and also foot. That is caused by Rocky Mountain spotted fever. It's potentially fatal. It's actually very serious. It causes a spotted rash. Very interesting thing is that it's actually caused by the Rickettsia group bacteria. However, especially if you're a parent, it's actually not related to rickets at all. That's a vitamin D deficiency. It's just ironically named the same thing. So that's just a fun fact. But definitely what's important on this, making sure to understand ticks, how to properly remove them, and then as well, understanding at least those 4 diseases that ticks can be able to cause. Tularemia, ehrlichiosis, I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right, Lyme disease, and Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Next, spiders. So this is the one where my wife checked out. She really did not want any part of this. But there are 4 spiders that we're really going to discuss and talk about a little bit much. That's important to be able to know. So first one, tarantula. Mostly docile. I mean, it's possible that a lot of you within this class maybe even have held one at one point. They're actually, for the most part, a lot of them are fairly patient. There are some that are aggressive, but their venom is fairly mild, like a bee sting, but typically without the anaphylactic shock that some people have. Interesting thing. So I grew up in southern Missouri, and during the months of September to October, there is a great tarantula migration of, I believe it's not the Lone Star. It's like the brown Texas tarantula. But either way, whenever I say migration, there will be a solid week or a couple of weeks where there are thousands of these tarantulas just moving across the ground. And so you're running over them in your car just because you can't get away from them. And just a fun fact, there's a lot of them that are just around. Next, hobo spider, otherwise known as the aggressive house spider. So these ones very commonly in the northwestern United States or northwestern North America. So especially Utah, Idaho, Oregon, Washington, Washington State. The interesting thing about these is actually a misnomer. So that name actually isn't real. So these bottom 2 pictures near it, that's what the hobo spider looks like. It's typically brown, a darker kind of brown. That's just a fun picture right there in the middle and the bottom. Just a hobo spider. It has the stick and it has a little bag, so it's a hobo. Anyway, but it's a misnomer. So the aggressive house spider. So the thing is that this spider, for the most part, is basically blind. It can't see anything. And so one of the most notable attributes of this spider is that if you flip on a light and you walk in on it, it'll charge at you. But because it's mostly blind and it actually startles very easily, There's only about 16 different directions this spider could go. So whenever you flip on a light and you yell or are startled, that spider is just running in a direction and it's trying to get away. It doesn't want anything to do with you. But sometimes it runs right towards you, and that's why it's been called the aggressive house spider. It does contain a cytotoxic venom, though. So they're very rarely they're not going to bite you unless they're really provoked or you're damaging any of their nest. But if they were to bite, they have a cytotoxic venom. If you're not familiar with what cytotoxic is, that actually primarily targets cells and tissues, and it actually causes them to break down and eat away at each other. The other one that we're going to talk about with a cytotoxic venom, that's a brown recluse. So if you've ever heard of that one, it's a lot more serious. But hobo spiders, for the most part, they like to stay by themselves. They like to stay fairly isolated, dark, moist areas, basements, crawl spaces, all the places you wouldn't want to run into a spider, mostly. Next, brown recluse. So this one is similar looking to the hobo spider. However, it's typically a lot lighter brown, except for if you look closely on the carapace, which is right behind the head on the top of the body, there is actually the shape of a violin. It kind of, again, peeks out like this and then points up. Sorry, I realized that, and then that. That's an easy identifier of whenever you're running into a brown recluse. These ones are a lot more aggressive and a lot more serious. They contain a cytotoxic venom, kill cells and tissues, found in North America. If you're bitten, go to the ER. It's a very serious thing, and it's very serious as well to make sure to identify exactly what type of spider bites you. Very similar to snakes, just because the different types of venom vary according to the different species and according to the different things. Just like with a snake, it's never a good idea to just grab a spider and then just bring it in with you. Try to grab it in a jar, try to get a picture of it, try to do something if you go to the hospital with this stuff. Never bring a live snake with you to the hospital. Anyway, next one, last one we're going to talk about is the Black Widow. This one's probably the most famous one. It's not the Marvel superhero. I know, I was disappointed too, but no, it actually is another arachnid. It's very infamous, and one of the telling pictures right here, that very bottom one underneath it, very key feature of it is it has a red hourglass symbol on its bottom, on the underneath side rather. So another interesting thing is that the males are actually harmless. Their venom doesn't really do anything. They're not very aggressive. They're fairly docile, and you can be able to hold them. But the females are anything but. So they're very aggressive. They're very territorial, and their venom is a lot more potent than the males. So this is especially concerning, as if you see that bottom right picture on the back, there's no symbol. It's a lot harder to be able to identify these spiders itself. It's only on that belly. And another key characteristic, unlike the brown recluse and the hobo spider, the Black Widow has a neurotoxic venom. And so it primarily affects the central nervous system. In all essence, the Black Widow, it's arguable on whether or not that one or the brown recluse is more serious. I personally would feel that the brown recluse is more serious, the cytotoxic venom, but the neurotoxic venom, because it affects your central nervous system, it's going to hurt a whole lot more because it's directly firing those synapses on your nerves a lot more rapidly than the brown recluse. The brown recluse, it may feel like a pinprick, and you may not even feel the bite at all until your skin almost starts eating away at itself and basically disintegrating in a way. If you've seen some pictures of it, of those bites, they can get pretty gnarly. I didn't throw it in for you guys. All right. So next, mosquitoes. Again, I told you we're going to talk about a lot of bugs and a lot of things, but let's keep going. I'm trying to condense it down as much as possible. So mosquitoes. There's going to be a lot in the reading, a lot of different ones that I was talking about. I tried to simplify it as much as possible. Mosquitoes are everywhere, they're worldwide. 4 specific mosquito-borne diseases that you should know, at least name alone, is West Nile virus, malaria, yellow fever, and dengue fever. So in addition to that, you should at least be familiar with what mosquitoes cause which ones. Primarily 2. I underlined the ones that are the most important to really remember. Mosquito-borne diseases, West Nile virus, that's caused by the Culex mosquito. So it's just a species of mosquito. If you look there in the right, there's kind of a very, now that I look at it, it's a very pixelated picture of it, so it's not very good. Next, malaria. That is caused by your Anopheles. That's right here, this brown one right there, smack dab in the middle. You don't have to identify it per the picture of it, but you should make those connections that West Nile virus is transmitted by the Culex mosquito, and the Anopheles mosquito transmits malaria. The other notable ones, yellow fever and dengue fever, those can be both caused by the Aedes aegypti. However, dengue fever can also be caused by the Aedes albopictus. So some other notable mentions that I believe the reading goes over as well includes like Zika and chikungunya. So those are 2 other mosquito-borne diseases that are also caused by Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus. But if you were to memorize at least only 2, West Nile virus, Culex, malaria, Anopheles. Controls. So there's a lot of different controls for this. Some of the most notable ones, irradiation. So that actually involves irradiating males to make them sterile so that whenever they go to try to reproduce with females, they can't. And so it's a way of being able to population control in the future. In addition to that, various different pesticides that you could look at, or source control, which includes like draining their habitats or areas where they might be able to flourish. A very common one actually has to do with leftover vehicle tires. So if you've ever seen a vehicle tire or picked one up that was just laying down, they almost always have water on the inside ring. That is the perfect breeding ground for mosquitoes. So draining those can be able to actually reduce mosquito population by a lot. But that's it. Mosquitoes, at least those 2 diseases and what they're associated, associated mosquitoes are. West Nile virus, Culex, malaria, Anopheles. Okay. Next, rats and mice. So again, there's going to be a lot of content on this one. I tried to simplify it as much as possible. Mice. So some key characteristics, and one of the best is the representative deer mice. They carry hantavirus. So it's just within their poop, very common in storage warehouses, and also potentially in homes. Mice, how they differ from rats, they typically have smaller bodies, longer tails, and they live typically in fields, barns, houses, in fairly normal locations that we would even live and interact with. That's why hantavirus is not a very good thing to mess around with. Rats, on the contrary, they typically have larger bodies and shorter tails. They typically eat decaying food and bad water, or they can eat decaying food and bad water. So the digestive tract is absolutely insane. They typically find themselves in dirtier, darker environments, typically around water, and that's why the predominant sewers, I think I misspelled that word. Anyway, sewers, that's their stereotypical living and breeding grounds that we hear in the media. But with that, how do you tell if you have mice or rats inside of your home? Definitely some big things to be able to look at are gnaw marks on various different, either pieces of food, on furniture, on the walls itself. That could be a good indicator. Same thing, droppings. So rat and mice poop that you find in various different cupboards, on the floor, or and really anywhere. So typically mice, again, smaller bodies, is about 1/4 of an inch are their size of dropping, where rats could be half to almost 3/4 of an inch, a lot bigger. That can help you better know what exactly you're dealing with, though, to better understand how to control them. Additional things to look for: grease marks on the walls. Again, rats, they're very dirty. And so there's a very good chance that there's grease on their exterior just from the environment that they're in. Same thing, urine stains, distinct odors. And another key indicator is that bottom right picture, which is flour on the floor. So if you suspect that you have rats, another option is spreading down some flour on the floor and looking for footprints the next day or soon after. That can be able to better indicate, do you actually have rats? Are they there? And then it's taking controls to mitigate it. Okay, so we just talked about a lot. Now we're going to switch gears and talk about some of the control measures, specifically the pesticides route or killer sprays, because it's not just pesticides, it's a lot of different sides. So rodenticide, hopefully a lot of these make sense by their name, but it's just identifying what type of side it is or spray it is. What does it kill? Rodenticide, rodents. Insecticide, insects. Ovicides, eggs. Molluscicide, mollusks. Herbicide, plants. Pesticides, pests. I feel for the most part, a lot of these should be fairly self-explanatory. The most important ones to be able to remember are herbicides and pesticides, insecticide, rodenticide. So, but hopefully those are able to kind of make sense and the readings go into them a little bit more as well. But it's important to be able to at least recognize what are they generally targeting. So speaking of targeting, what it targets. So there are two things that you should ask yourselves whenever you're looking at any of these sprays or any of these sides in a way. What it targets and how it targets or how it attacks. So what it targets, there are two different criteria. It could either be selective or non-selective. So an example is an herbicide. And a selective herbicide targets specific species or types. So for example, this herbicide, such as the picture right there in the middle, it's a weed and grass killer. If this herbicide only targeted dandelions, that is a selective herbicide. However, this one right here in the middle just says weed and grass killer. So if it's non-selective, it targets all species. So that means it destroys all plants, weeds, grass, roses, dandelions, everything. And so definitely if you're using these, it's important to be able to be as selective as possible. Because non-selective, it's going to kill absolutely everything that's there. And it's not very specific. Then next, how it attacks. So this is either through contact or translocating, otherwise known as systemic. So contact means that if you spray this on the leaf of a dandelion, it's going to kill that leaf and that leaf alone. But if you were to spray this on the leaf and it's a translocating or systemic herbicide, it's going to kill the entire organism. As long as it touches the organism, it's going to kill it. For contact, it only kills what it touches. So again, what it targets, how it attacks. It either is selective or non-selective, or it is contact or translocating on attacks. That picture in the bottom right, that is actually what we're going to talk about a little bit more, but you're definitely going to be researching and more familiar with this next week with the DDT debate. If you haven't looked at that, be sure to look at it. It is the application assignment. It's going to take some time, but this is actually a picture of back in the early days, the use of a pesticide known as DDT. And one of the common uses as well, they would spray it over absolutely everything. For example, this farmer is spraying it on these cattle to be able to make it so that they're not being afflicted by so many insects itself. This was very, very common as people both knew and didn't know what some of the effects of these pesticides were. So speaking of that, insecticides. Insecticides. There are 4 different insecticides that we're going to discuss that you should be at least a little bit familiar with what they are. I'm going to only talk about them briefly. The readings do a great job. of going into these, so definitely reflect on those. But at the very least, know that these four exist and that they're insecticides. There are organochlorides, inorganic chemicals, organophosphates, and carbamates. So organochlorides, this is possibly some of the most famous ones whenever it comes to insecticides. This is where we get DDT, heptachlor, endrin, aldrin. So these are some of your more serious insecticides. These are a lot of your most dangerous ones because they bioaccumulate within the body. Don't know what bioaccumulate means. What it means is that your body, whenever it doesn't know what to do with things, it typically shoves it and stores it in one area. For example, as far as a lot of our artificial sweeteners, the body doesn't know what to do with it, so it stores it and throws it in fat until it can figure it out. Well, very similar. A lot of these things, like DDT, it stores it in the liver or the kidneys. And then as time goes on, it doesn't get rid of it. And so as you're continually exposed, it then just accumulates more and more within these areas. And that's where these health effects and death occur. But in these pictures, these ones all are illustrated or kind of outline the message of DDT in the early years. There's that first top picture. DDT is good for me, and it shows a dog, an apple, a woman, a cow, and a potato, and it really just illustrates a lot of the pro-propaganda that was trying to convince the public that DDT was a good and a safe thing when it in fact it wasn't. Actually, one of the very first individuals to really look into this was this individual on the most right, Rachel Carson, Dr. Rachel Carson. She investigated DDT exposure within the environment and how prevalent it was as well in her book known as Silent Spring. If you haven't read that, there's an amazing book. I would highly suggest it, as it really informs your perspective on insecticide use and how prevalent it is throughout the United States, but also throughout the world. One of the things that it illustrated is that there is no place on Earth that DDT is not present. In fact, they've even been able to take core samples in the Antarctic that contain trace amounts of DDT in it as well. And so right here in the bottom left picture, you'll see there's bald eagle. That's the overall premise of the book. I don't want to spoil it, but one of the big things that really was a psychological blow to the United States as well is that DDT almost wiped out the bald eagle entirely. It actually caused that the shells on the outside of a bald eagle's egg, it wasn't as durable, so these eagles were unintentionally killing their young, and the population of bald eagles decreased dramatically. Huge issue, but very big psychological issue, as that is the nation's bird here in the United States as well. Either way, I won't talk about too much. That was about it. Organochlorides bioaccumulates within the body. Good example is DDT. Inorganic chemicals, that includes like lead, arsenate, mercury, sulfur, basically things that you can see on a periodic table and pronounce. It's an inorganic chemical. Organophosphates, methylparthenon, diazinon, malathion. These ones you actually find still in use today. Some of these have been banned, but a lot of these are still here. And then carbamates, 7 aldecarbon. Just know at least those 4 different types of insecticides, and naturally this week you're going to have to research and look into DDT a lot more. Then one of the last topics is integrated pest management, otherwise known as IPM. So the big thing is that what this is it's a management system to mitigate and control pests. Specifically, it illustrates and focuses on making chemical use the last resort whenever trying to take care of pests. And so what you can see here is it's kind of like the food pyramid. So it has various different levels, starting with the bottom, the biggest slice, all the way going up to the very top, the peak, which is the smallest slice. This is able to help you better understand the order of preference whenever you're trying to control pests, whether it's in your house or within your workplace or any of these measures. So in order of preference, typically you'll find that the best option is 1, prevention. just not allowing them to get there in the first place. But once they're there, is trying to make cultural changes, then mechanical changes, biological changes, and then that last resort is chemical changes. And so let's go over each one of those specifically just to be able to better understand what they are. So cultural controls or cultural changes. So these things could involve habitat modification, rotating crops, eliminating food, water, living areas, such as dumping water reservoirs for mosquitoes. Cultural changes or cultural controls, they're all things that we could do based upon how we perform work or how we accomplish a task. A really good example is that top right picture right here. This one just illustrates a 3-year rotation pattern for planting crops. So for example, it says year 1, you grow different kind of nightshade type vegetables, such as tomatoes. And so then the next year, you'll go into a transitional bed, which is more things like broccoli that actually help to that have a greater affinity of competing against weed development or weeds growing within your field. And then the next year, actually going into more weed sensitive crops. So things where weeds have a very easy time overpowering. That way you can be able to capitalize that you just got rid of most of the weeds the year before. And so those things such as carrots. And then those carrots then create a lot more mulch and a lot more of waste products. That mulch then helps the nightshades grow better. So nightshades then to broccoli, and it just rotates in this way. You're able to plan ahead, and what you plant today could help out next year. Next, mechanical controls. These include barriers, screens, seals, or pest proofing. So this picture right here in the middle, it just looks kind of like a greenhouse. You're isolating this area to hopefully reduce the amount of pests that you have. That would be a mechanical control, creating a barrier or screen so that pests can't get in physically. Then biological control. Biological control, one of the best examples is introducing a predator or natural enemies into the environment itself. A great example are ladybugs. Ladybugs, possibly an apex predator. These things eliminate so many other pest insects. It's crazy. Specifically aphids and weevils, which can be able to account for a lot of crop loss, for example. So introduction of ladybugs can be able to help that, and that's a biological control because you're just letting nature sort itself out. You're just forcing the hand of nature a little bit more. Then lastly, chemical control. So this includes, as far as pesticide timing, trying to make sure that you're using a selective pesticide. For example, if it is a pesticide that's an ovicide that targets eggs of pests or insects, then you're trying to time it correctly when those pests are in that specific stage, so that then you can be able to control them appropriately. Another thing is insect growth regulators. So what this does is spraying it on a bug, it actually forces it to not reach adulthood. So it doesn't reach that time where it actually can actively reproduce. Therefore, less of a chance you're going to have pests. With these, again, the integrated pest management system, it's almost that hierarchy of controls. It's trying to say what is the most preferred method before we have to resort to chemical use. And so understanding these at least a little bit, being able to identify, oh, they're using a barrier, that's a mechanical control. Oh, they're rotating their crops, that's a cultural control. Oh, they're introducing a predator or a natural enemy to control the pest, biological control. Or, oh, they're spraying insecticide, that's a chemical control. The readings, again, do a great job. I believe it's just on the reading page. It goes into this a little bit more, but ultimately, that's it. So definitely this week, there's a lot of different things, but hopefully this weekly review can kind of condense it a little bit more. You can be a little more targeted in your studying, and hopefully it doesn't feel too overwhelming as well. Definitely, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I'd love to be able to help out any way I can. And yeah, hope you have a great week.